In 1970, there was a battle for the British executive car market with 16 different models available across Europe. It's a fight that was even more intense by the end of the decade, and it's something I remember well. This is the sort of car my father was purchasing, and I often went along with him to kick the tyres, so to speak. I'm not going to talk about ultra-luxury cars like Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Aston Martin or Jaguar, although Mercedes has snuck in there mainly because they were used for more regular transportation in Germany. I'm thinking more the premium mass market that was occupied by Rover in the UK and BMW in Germany. And I'm going to stick with large four-door, mostly saloons, so no two-door midlife crisis cars. Anyway, without further ado, here's the 1970s executive car story. At the start of the 1970s, the executive market was dominated by two cars from Rover and Triumph. Rover's main offering was the P6 that they'd launched 7 years earlier, and in fact the older P5 was still on sale, but the P6 was the one to have. Rover had also just launched the Range Rover, but in 1970 that was seen more as a farm vehicle than a luxury town cruiser. That shift would come much later. Rover had been integrated into British Leyland, as had Rover's old competitor Triumph. They'd been selling the 2000 as long as Rover had been selling the P6. They were good cars, but not in my family's league yet. We made do with the lower-end Austin 1800, the much maligned Land Crab, also from the British Leyland stable. If you were looking for something British yet American, Ford still offered the executive version of the Zodiac, but it was a slow-selling model. Ford was well aware of that and was beavering away on a replacement. Ford's big rival General Motors owned Vauxhall, who offered a similar model, the Viscount, a luxury version of the Vauxhall Cresta, and it sold about as poorly as Ford's Zodiac. For those that wanted something a bit more exotic and didn't mind a higher price due to import tariffs, there were various models from the continent. Over in France, Citroën had just launched the SM that cost a lot more than most of the cars I'm going to talk about here, but the long-running DS was still on sale and was as good as ever. Peugeot had replaced the 404 with the new 504, but Britain wasn't their main focus. They sold their car, of course, in France, but also had a good business exporting this hardy car to South America and Africa. Over in Italy, Fiat offered the Pininfarina styled 130, the top of their range. Italy always had a problem with large cars as the government taxed engines over 2 litres heavily, so this car was expensive to purchase. Lancia was still selling the Flaminia, launched 13 years earlier, but this would be its last year of production. They also offered the Flavia that itself was almost 10 years old and due for an update that would soon arrive. These cars provided luxury and comfort, but failed to offer that one thing essential for an expensive car: reliability. To be fair, no car in 1970 was great at this, but one country was doing better than most: Germany. Mercedes 200 series launched in 1968, and even then this was a much sought after car, but out of the price range of the average Rover or Triumph customer. A little more reasonable was BMW's large car, the New 6. It was the first BMW to feature 4 headlights that's become such an iconic look. It featured a new 6-cylinder engine that would go on to be the mainstay of 5, 6 and 7 series cars throughout the 1980s. At this time, BMW were only in the process of becoming a luxury brand. Remember, they were selling bubble cars just 8 years earlier. But Audi had even further to go. The 1968 Audi 100 was the new top of their range, and a statement that they intended to take on Germany's other 2 luxury car companies. If you wanted a little safety in your car, up in Sweden, Volvo was selling the 164, the first 6-cylinder car they'd ever produced. And although it's a little small compared to other cars on this list, I should also mention the Saab 99 that was pitched as Saab's first luxury car. So that's the choice in 1970. It was almost identical in 1971, the only difference being that the Lancia Flavia was given a facelift and renamed the 2000. In 1972, the Vauxhall Viscount entered production, meaning luxury seekers would have to make do with the next car down in Vauxhall's lineup, the Victor. It was updated for 1972 with the highest trim level sold as the Vauxhall Ventura with a 3.3 litre six-cylinder engine. While Vauxhall was taking a step back due to slow sales of the Viscount, Ford were taking a step forwards to combat slow Zodiac sales. Its replacement was intended to be called the Granada after the Spanish city, but after the TV company with the same name threatened a lawsuit, Ford hedged their bets, calling the lower models the Consul and the upper models the Granada. After legal issues were resolved, the Consul name was dropped. The Granada was a breath of fresh air in the UK, where customers generally bought locally produced cars. Their choices were looking increasingly long in the tooth. After all, Rover and Triumph were now almost 10 years old. In fact, the last new British car that had appeared was Ford's own Zodiac in 1966. With little else new on offer, the well-made, stylish Granada sold well. Over in Germany, there was another new car that would go on to have a long life. BMW introduced the 5 Series, a car a little smaller than the new 6, but still a large executive saloon, and it would go from strength to strength. Not many Brits were dreaming of owning a BMW 5 Series, but it became a little more affordable at the start of 1973 when the UK joined the common market, the forerunner of the European Union. Suddenly those French, Italian and German luxury cars were a viable option rather than the usual Rovers, Triumphs, Fords and Vauxhalls. Some people, including my dad, decided to take the plunge and buy foreign. In his case, the Audi 100. Surprisingly, buying a Ford or a Vauxhall, both American-owned companies, was still considered a British purchase as they employed a high degree of British workers to design and produce the cars, even though the profits went abroad. In 1974, Volvo introduced a brand new model, the 200 series. The 264 was the top-of-the-line replacement for the 164. Volvo would become the alternative choice to drive, again focusing on safety but also offering features other cars from sunnier climes weren't offering, such as heated seats and headlamp wash wipe. Surprisingly, they also offered air conditioning, and they likely went to the trouble of adding it to help sell it in the US market. Volvo weren't the only company with a new model in 1974. Citroën finally replaced the DS with a new CX. It might look like a hatchback and it would take very little to turn it into one, but Citroën were famously against hatchbacks, certainly on large cars, and it's true that people who bought this class of cars weren't drawn to hatchbacks. Audi would produce an Avant version of the next generation 100, and it's a car I certainly encouraged my dad to get. I thought it was fantastic. But like many, he preferred saloon cars. The Avant can't have been much of a success as Audi dropped it when they released the third generation car. British Leyland might not have released a new executive car since 1963, but they corrected that in 1975 with the 1822. Like the Citroën CX, it looked like a hatchback, but was really a saloon. It was designed to replace the unloved Austin 1800 Land Crab, and the upmarket executive version had a Wolseley badge. It was hard to get a new one at launch due to demand, but also because British Leyland's constant problems with strikes meant not enough were being produced. It didn't help that British Leyland went bankrupt right after the 1822 appeared. To confuse matters, just 6 months after its glitzy launch, its name changed to the Princess. But the nail in the coffin was poor reliability. Demand dried up and customers started looking elsewhere, like to new cars on the continent. Peugeot released the new 604, a larger and more luxurious addition to their range. Renault also entered the fray with the 30 that had a 2.7 litre V6 engine. Like Italy, France taxed cars with large engines, and that discouraged their car companies from developing larger cars, which left the market open for Germany, Sweden and the UK. Unlike the competition, the Renault 30 had a hatchback like the innovative Renault 16 that debuted in 1965. The Princess might have been struggling, but British Leyland had high hopes that the replacement for the ancient Rover P6 and Triumph 2000 would be a big hit. The hatchback Rover SD1 launched in 1976. Like the Princess, it was a massive hit, but strikes meant not enough could be sold. And also like the Princess, very quickly customers discovered it had major quality problems. Maybe it shouldn't have been such a surprise. If you can't get the level of quality on the Princess up to the standard of the competition, you couldn't expect the higher end Rover to fare any better. It was hard to focus on both production volume and quality when management and workers were involved in a daily them and us pitched battle. Lancia ended production of the 2000 and replaced it with the Gamma. The Pininfarina styled car was stylish, but like the Fiat 130, it didn't excite customers and would damage Lancia's finances. Mercedes, on the other hand, were doing just fine, and the 200 series would get an update. Like the previous model, it sold well around the world and became a regular sight as a taxi of all things in its native Germany. Today it's not unheard of for people to keep cars for 10 years or so, but in the 1970s reliability concerns meant cars were traded in much more often. After owning the first generation Audi for a couple of years, my father replaced it for the second generation that launched in 1976. German cars became known for their reliability, and they were certainly produced to a higher spec than the Rover SD1, but they weren't without their problems. When we received our new Audi, there was some gunk in the bottom of the fuel tank that, when sucked up, caused problems with the engine. And this picture must have been taken when the car was new, as when it returned, the fog lamps had been stolen. There was also supposed to be cruise control, but that wasn't ready when the first cars were delivered. The next generation Audi 100 built on the success of the first model, and more people were finding that they were a smart purchase, coming in cheaper than BMW and Mercedes, with great build quality and lively performance thanks to its new 5-cylinder engine. Another car that got an update was the Ford Granada in 1977, selling very well in the UK thanks to its good looks and reliability. My dad test drove one but discounted it due to its high road noise and stuck with his Audi. The second generation Granada was a hit though, and became a familiar sight on British roads. Mercedes got more competition when BMW launched the 7 Series, effectively replacing the new 6. It offered more luxury, better quality and more features, but it wasn't cheap, certainly out of my dad's price range. He test drove a 5 Series around this time, to my recollection, and would eventually purchase a 7 Series, but that was in 1986 as a closeout special when BMW were introducing the second generation model. 1978 saw a flurry of new models, but really from just one manufacturer. Vauxhall finally replaced the Victor-based VX models with not 1 or 2, but 3 different models, and Vauxhall didn't have much of a hand in developing any of them. That honour had been passed to GM's German subsidiary Opel. The first of these cars was the Carlton, sold as the Record in Germany. While this was the first generation Carlton in the UK, it was the 5th generation Record on the continent. The top of the line Carlton was badged as the Vauxhall Viceroy in the UK and the Opel Commodore in the rest of Europe. One step above this was the Vauxhall Royale. This was a stretched version of the Carlton Viceroy with an even higher trim level, also known as the Opel Senator. This all made for a very confusing lineup, but it was a 3-pronged attack on Ford's Granada, and if Opel could take sales from its German rivals, all the better. The last new model of 1978 was from Saab. They replaced the 99 with the 900, a more worthy executive cruiser with a bit of turbo pep to liven it up. The 1970 Range Rover was still on sale, and customers were starting to use it as a luxury cruiser around town. If I'm going to mention that car, I also have to include the Mercedes G-Wagon that launched in 1979. Like the Range Rover, it was intended as a rough and ready all-terrain vehicle, but would eventually become adopted as a luxury cruiser. Also in 1979, Peugeot updated their 504 as the 505. Like the 504, it would go on to sell well in South America and Africa, with 1.3 million vehicles produced. Fiat had by now given up the luxury battle, ending 130 production in 1977, but Alfa Romeo would take up the baton with the Alfa 6, their first large luxury car since the 6-cylinder 2600 in the 1960s. Work on the new car had begun in the late 1960s with a release plan for the early 1970s, but a quadrupling of the price of fuel in 1973 meant Alfa cancelled the launch of this large V6 engined car. With demand for large cars rebounding in the late 1970s, and despite this Bertone design and the underlying mechanicals showing their age, Alfa dusted off their plans and launched this new car in 1979, just in time for another fuel crisis. The 505 and Alfa 6 might be new, but in the UK, French and Italian cars still had a bad reputation for reliability and rust, as were British Leyland's cars thanks to the Princess and Rover SD1. Vauxhalls weren't known as being that good after some awful models in the 50s and 60s. This would soon change in the 1980s with Opel engineered cars, but we weren't quite there yet. One thing that mattered for luxury cars was reliability, and the smart money in the late 1970s was on the Ford Granada and BMW, Mercedes and now Audi. It's no surprise then that at the end of the 1970s my father bought yet another Audi, the new flagship 200 Turbo. This matched BMW's and Mercedes' quality and finish, but at a reduced price. In the 1980s, Brits warmed to Audi with the successful Vorsprung durch Technik advertising campaign, and the German three-horse luxury battle would begin in earnest. As the 1970s dawned, there was a plethora of choice in the executive car market. By the end of the decade, it was even greater. But the range coming from Britain hadn't grown. In 1970, British Leyland had the UK market pretty much sewn up. By the end of the 70s, they were almost irrelevant. Customers of not just executive cars, but all cars realised they could have much better reliability and started demanding it. And that was found on German engineered cars. It's maybe no surprise that the Ford Granada and Opel's luxury cruisers were also developed in Germany. But as the 1980s dawned, it became clear that reliability wasn't enough. An executive car needed to have the right brand. The future belonged to BMW, Mercedes and Audi. I've done videos on many of the cars I've mentioned here, and there's links to all of them in the description. There's links to a couple on the right as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.